I would like to thank our parents, teachers, staff, and our community stakeholders for being engaged in this process. As we know, it is dependent upon our district being collectively working together to ensure that our students' best interests are met. This is our 8th Budget and Finance Committee meeting for the 2018-2019 school year for the Metropolitan Nashville Board of Education. The board's goal this year was to develop a budget that meets the needs of all of our students, and we've worked diligently to do so. More than any other year, equity has been on the forefront of our discussions and our work this year. This has challenged us to ask ourselves, how can we ensure that our schools get the dollars that they need based upon the resources that we have available? While doing so, not only have more dollars been allocated towards our neediest schools, but we've also been intentional about ensuring that our English language learners and our students who receive exceptional education services receive additional dollars from our student-based budgets. In this, we remain confident that our focus on equity is met, and it will have a positive impact on the performance of our school district as a whole. We recently presented our budget proposal to Mayor Browley, and over the course of the next few weeks, we must realign our budget proposal to the dollars that have been allocated to us. Our total budget allocation falls short of what was needed for us to maintain our status quo budget that would not require us to make tough reductions. However, it is my hope that our revised budget will protect classroom resources and minimize disruptions inside of our classrooms. Our students have made impressive academic progress as a result of the work of our incredible staff, and I'm confident that our revised budget will allow us to maintain the progress we've made over the course of the past year. Our goals for tonight's presentation are to give a general overview of our strategic plan, which drives our budgeting, to help our community understand our mandatory costs and what is included in our original budget request that must now be adjusted, and to discuss our priorities as we work to realign our budget. I will open the floor for our board to ask our administration questions, and then we will close. I'm proposing that we schedule also 2 additional budget meetings on May 15th and May 22nd. We will vote on the budget at the May 22nd budget meeting and present our revised budget to the Metro Council on May 23rd. At this time, I will open the floor for our chair, Anna Shepard. She will address the board and the community regarding next year's budget, and then she will yield the microphone to Dr. Joseph to begin his presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Hunter. I appreciate that. So sometimes we need days like Saturdays where it's raining so badly you don't want to go anywhere. So that on this weekend, as I took that opportunity on Saturday to get my mind around some thoughts around this budget process, so bear with me if you don't mind. And so I'd like to make a few observations as board chair. And I know that everyone, parents, students, teachers, all of us have a lot of anxiety right now. We've got to come to grips with the fact that this is a very unusual moment in time. After all of the city's dynamic growth, no one predicted, and quite frankly, no one understands why the metropolitan government is strapped for cash. Going into this budget season, no one could predict, or no one knew, that we would start with one mayor and end up the fiscal year with a different mayor. We didn't anticipate unrest on the board over administrative decisions that are now being examined through an audit, which is always a healthy process for any organization to go through. But despite all of the unexpected developments and turmoil, we are where we are, and it is our job to deal with it. The reality is we're not going to get what we wanted in the upcoming fiscal year. The $5 million recommended by the mayor will cover inflationary adjustments alone. That obviously is not ideal, but it doesn't make sense for folks to challenge our new mayor at a time when he's got so many overwhelming issues in front of him. What I'd like to propose is that we partner with Mayor Browley, accept the fact that we're going to be dealing with basically a status quo budget that will cover inflationary costs at best. In the near term, this is what is going to require everyone involved to make some sacrifices. As much as we regret it, teachers and support staff won't get raises this year, and that bothers me a lot. We won't be able to fund the expansion of literacy initiatives. Again, that bothers me quite a bit. We won't be able to fund the expansion of literacy initiatives, and charter schools may not get the new growth money unless we're prepared to make cuts in traditional schools. But we've got to accept the fact that we're all in this together, and pitting different groups against each other is not going to get us where we need to be. These fiscal problems weren't created overnight, and they're not going to be solved overnight. In addition to working with Mayor Briley, we've got to get through this period of austerity. I'd like to suggest that we rethink our approach to this budget, especially as it relates to fund balance. While the recommended funding level isn't what we wanted, one good thing about this is that this will be the first time in a very long time that the mayor and Metro Council won't be balancing the school's budget using our cash reserves or fund balance. That would be akin to paying your mortgage and your utility bills every month out of your savings account. At some point, that savings account is going to be depleted. When it comes to fiscal responsibility, using one-time money to fund recurring expenses is actually a no-no. In the future, we should stick to the path that the mayor is putting us on, not drawing down our savings account to pay the mortgage. If we've got excess one-time money, as our reserves will replenish in the future, and they will, I'd like for us to consider a policy that we spend it only on one-time expenses. Bonuses for employees, professional development, and other legitimate one-time expenses. That's a larger conversation that we need to have with the mayor and the council who ultimately decide our fate. But we can get through this next year by working together, locking hands. That's, again, let's partner with Mayor Briley. Let's get through this current budget process by acknowledging that this is going to be a status quo budget year. Let's ask everyone to tighten their belts, and let's work with the mayor, the council, MNEA, SEIU, and others to kick off a conversation about what's going to take adequate funding for public education for the long term. I'd like to hear from Dr. Joseph and his staff. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Board Chair Shepherd, and good evening, everyone. So I'm just going to give a brief overview before I turn it over to Mr. Henson, and my overview is really going to talk about where we've been, the progress we've made, and really talk a little bit about our strategic plan, because it's the strategic plan that ultimately drives our budget as we move forward. And as you came in, you should have received a paper. We put it on the screens as well, but we know it's hard to see on the screen, so we gave you some papers to look at, because I just wanted to remind you, in 5 days, it'll actually be 2 years since I signed my contract to proudly serve as the director of Metro Nashville Public Schools. It was Friday the 13th, and I'm not a superstitious person, but I just remember I pay attention to details. And, what a great journey this board and I have been on. Over the course of the first year, we developed a very clear, very bold, very focused strategic framework. And the sheet that you have in front of you kind of characterizes that. And we have boldly communicated that we want to be the fastest improving urban district in the country in the short term. In the long term, we just want to be the best. We don't want to characterize it by saying we're the best urban district, or we just want to be the best district, period, in the country, and that's the ultimate goal. We tried to make it simple as we developed the plan over the last year by saying we're going to focus on our students, our people, our organization, and our community. And over the course of the year, we've identified strategies, high-level strategies, and we've been working on executing those strategies this year. And we have clear key performance indicators for our school district. And at today's at today's board meeting, you're actually going to hear about the progress that we're making in the area of our organization. But if you flip to the back of the paper that I had in front of you and click the slide on the screen up there, you'll see over the course of these past 2 years, we have made clear progress. We're doing better in reading, grades 2 through 8. We're doing better in mathematics in grades 2 through 8. Suspensions are down. Attendance is up. We need to work on expelling our expulsions, because our expulsions are actually higher than they've been. And also, we're sending more students to alternative centers. And that's why when we looked in this strategic plan that we have developed, we've been talking about social emotional learning, because we recognize we have to give students the tools that they need to be successful. So, over the course of these past 2 years, we've used the dollars that we've had well to actually be doing much better. I mean, the school system is moving in a positive direction. And as we move towards the future, now it's an opportunity for us to really come together, working with not only the mayor's office, but also our business organization to figure out how do we move to the next level, because we've got to make adjustments now with this budget that are going to challenge us. Because as you look at the bottom of the sheet, you'll see we had 7 priority areas, and in those 7 priority areas, that's where we've been pushing. That's where we have been putting resources over the past 2 years, and we believe these are the reasons we're getting the results that we're seeing. Again, for the first time, moving faster than the nation in reading, moving faster than the nation in math, with the exception of 5th grade mathematics for every student group. I mean, it's a moment to celebrate. And now, as we go through this budget season, our real challenge is to make sure how do we maintain that level of excellence and continue to move forward and make progress. Now, we believe we can do so because we have some of the most outstanding employees in the country who have been working tirelessly to make things happen. And so even though this year, it's a year where we must tighten our belts, our commitment to the community is that we're going to commit to this plan, and we're going to keep moving forward. Even in difficult times, we don't make excuses, and we won't move backwards. But it's going to take work for us to do as we look at our budget to make that happen. So at this time, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mr. Henson. Mr. Henson's going to walk us through the context and the status of our current budget. He'll remind us of what we asked for and what we intended to do. He'll talk to us about what we can do with those $5 million additional dollars that we have, and he'll talk to us about what we must do now to realign our budget to meet the needs of, or to meet the amount that we have as we take it to the council. The goal today isn't to be specific about what will ultimately be cut, because when you're talking about the number that Mr. Henson's going to talk about, it's going to take us some time to work towards that, but he will give you our thinking on areas that we can explore. And then we can have a conversation, as Mrs. Shepherd discussed, that there are we've got to look at all options as we think about tightening our belts. And we'll answer questions and comments from the board, and we will conclude knowing that we'll come back next week. And when we come next week, we'll have a specific plan to address the reductions that we'll ultimately need to make. So, Mr. Henson, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph, and good afternoon. Everyone, I believe, has a copy of the approved budget that this Board of Education approved back on April 16th, and I will reference that document if you'll turn to page 1. Of course, page 1 is the summary of changes that were proposed and approved by the board on April 16th. And I wanted to direct your attention to a few of the items on here. The first one up in the compensation area, certificated insurance. The Employee Insurance Trust voted to increase premiums for our teachers and support employees, that the district as the employer pays 75% of those premiums by 7.9%. And that increase in the insurance premium amounts to between $6.3 and $6.4 million. And so that is something that we are going to have to do based upon the action that the Employee Insurance Trust made based upon the recommendations from the actuary and the consultant regarding the health of that Employee Insurance Trust fund. The next item is the item below that, certificated pension. All of our teachers and certificated employees are required to be members of the state Tennessee Consolidated Retirement System. That is administered, of course, by the state of Tennessee, and they notified us earlier that there would be an employer contribution rate increase. That rate increase is about a 15.2% increase for next year. We don't have any choice in the matter. It's something that we're required to do by the state, and that cost is around $4.7 million. We also have, as you know, in the middle part of the page, the increase for our charter enrollment and the increase in the per pupil amount for our charters. We are estimating approximately an additional 1,188 students with an increase to the per pupil amount that is distributed to charter schools that's based upon the per pupil amount of the entire district of all students in Metropolitan Nashville Public Schools. And that estimate is around $14 million based upon the projected increase in enrollment and increase in the per pupil amount that would be transferred. Between those three items that I mentioned, the insurance increase for our teachers and certificated employees, the pension cost increase for our teachers and certificated employees, and for the increased for the charter additional enrollment and increase in the per pupil amount, those total approximately $25 million. So if we talk about looking at the $5 million the additional $5 million that's been proposed by the mayor, we see that we're in a deficit situation of $20 million. We also have taken into consideration vacancy and turnover. We try to estimate that the best we can, knowing that with as many employees as we have, there will be some vacancy and some turnover throughout the year, and some savings will be realized from that. We realize that savings on the front end, and so we've been estimating that for next year at $3 million. So that $25 million goes down to $22 million. Comparing that to the $5 million in additional funding in the mayor's budget, we're down to needing to reduce $17 million from the current year budget. We're basically washing the FICA savings that is generated through employees' insurance premiums coming out pre-tax. We're washing that with the inflationary and other required increases. For some of that is the new expenses as it relates to the opening of the new Eagle View Elementary School. We also have some other metro government charges that we receive that are included in there. So we're basically washing those out. We've talked about the $7.2 million in reduction based upon the decrease in projected or estimated number of students from this past year to this year. And if you remember in our budget discussions, we reinvested that $7.2 million back into the student-based budgeting formula. Those funds, of course, go directly out to schools. We enhanced that formula by increasing the weights for our exceptional education students and increasing the weight for our English learner students. $5.2 million for exceptional education and $2 million for English learners. So if we look at that scenario that I just attempted to go through, as I said, we've got approximately $22 million in additional costs. We have $5 million in additional funding. Therefore, the difference is $17 million that must be reduced even if we don't do any of the other improvements, which would include, as was indicated, there would be no pay raises, no step increases included in that number, and there would be no improvements that were proposed included in that number, specifically the improvements for social emotional learning, the additional $2.5 million for textbooks, particularly the science adoption, the additional funding for the paraprofessional educators upgrade in their pay rate. None of those improvements that we have been talking about and that had been proposed would be included in that $17 million number that we must reduce to meet the $5 million increase that's being proposed by the mayor. You can see at the bottom of the page our original request was for $44.7 million increase. Obviously, with a $5 million increase, that falls short almost $40 million from what the board approved on April the 16th. Wanted to point out one other thing as it relates to funding sources that we were just made aware of on Tuesday afternoon when the mayor submitted the budget. It is true they are not proposing to utilize any of our fund balance reserve to fund this additional $5 million, which I think we're all glad to hear that. Our fund balance is now projected at approximately $30 million, which is around 3.4%. At the end of the year. However, there was an inclusion in the budget ordinance, and it was followed by a letter from the Metro Finance Director. Included in our funding sources for our operating budget, they are proposing would be proceeds from the sale of the Merle School property in the amount of $13 million. So that is one of the sources of funding that they're using. Of course, that would be one-time funding. Funding that they're proposing to use to fund our operating budget would be proceeds of $13 million from the sale of the Merle School property. Of course, the board has not taken that up yet, has not declared that property surplus. We've not had that discussion, so I'm assuming we will at some point in the future. But I did want to make the board aware of that, since that is being proposed as a source of funding for our operating budget. And I'll stop there because I know I shared a lot of information with you. I'll stop there and see what questions you may have.
Madam Chair, could I ask a question? So, Mr. Henson, you're saying the $13 million from the Merle sale would be an additional set of funding, or they're banking on selling that property to even give us the $5 million?
The latter. They're banking on selling that property for $13 million for us to receive the $5 million. And the reason for all of that is because they used a little over $19 million of our fund balance for the current year budget, plus our state BEP revenue is decreasing because Davidson County's fiscal capacity index is increasing substantially based upon the new assessed property values and the retail sales tax base. And so we are actually seeing a decrease in our state BEP funding because that fiscal capacity index indicates that Davidson County has a higher ability to fund education from its own local sources, specifically relating to the assessed property values and the retail sales tax base. But yes, to your question, that $13 million is already included in the additional $5 million that's been proposed.
I'm a little confused. So is the $13 million not ours already?
The $13 million has not.
For the property, the property.
It is our property. It is the school district's property. And so apparently the plan is for the school district to sell that property and the proceeds to come back and help fund our operating budget for next year.
Ms. Gentry, Dr. Gentry.
So help me. Have we voted to make the Merle building surplus yet?
No.
Okay, that would be a no. So in order for us to get $5 million, we would have to first vote to make it surplus. And then of the $13 million, so where does the 8 go? I'm right numbers here, right?
You have to remember they first had to make up the $19 million in fund balance that was used to fund the current year budget. That was
So the whole,
that was the first thing that funding had to go.
so the hole that was already gouged out of our reserves has to be filled first.
First, that's correct. And then we had the difference in the state BEP funding, both current year and next year, based upon the rising fiscal capacity index, where we're actually receiving fewer state dollars through the BEP funding formula.
Ms. Shepherd.
So to the point that you just made about the BEP formula is being changed because we have a greater fiscal capacity to fund our schools, was any consideration made, I know the answer to this question, was any consideration made about the assessment appeals?
We've asked that question, specifically asked it, and the answer is what they are using would be last year's assessments, and so it's always a year in arrears, but it's a 3-year average to help smooth some of the big changes. But from what I understand, they've never seen a fiscal capacity index increase like ours has increased, because, like Davidson County's has increased because of the property values and because of the retail sales tax base. That's all handled, the calculation of the fiscal capacity index. It's actually 2 indices. One is calculated by TASER, Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. The other is calculated by the Center for Business and Economic Research in UT Knoxville, which is Dr. Bill Fox. and they use 50% of the TASER index and 50% of the CBER index to get that. And they're all calculated even outside of the Department of Education. And so we've asked that question specifically regarding the appeals of the assessed values and how that would play into our fiscal capacity. So they're aware we're asking about it. We haven't received. The only answer we've received is they use data that's based on the previous year, so it's always 1 year in arrears.
Dr. Gentry, Mr. Pinkston, then Mrs. Pierce.
Okay. Has the property been appraised?
We had, I'm assuming you're talking about the Merle School property?
Yes,
Yeah. We had that appraised back in February because if you remember from some previous Capital Needs Committee meetings, we had been in discussions with MDHA about a potential land swap with some property on Hermitage Avenue to potentially build a new Nashville School of the Arts. And so we had it appraised back in February, and it was appraised at $7.1 million.
Mr. Pinkston.
But we still get 5. I'm just checking.
So this is an observation and really a request to Ms. Harkey with Metro Legal and Mr. Henson, who I'm sure is participating in whatever discovery is going on in our BEP litigation involving Baker Donaldson. I'm familiar with both the CBER and the TASER fiscal capacity analyses. Neither of them take into account the fact that in Nashville we have a Metro Charter amendment that was put on circa 2005 that basically creates artificial limits to our ability to raise additional revenue in the city of Nashville. And the BEP needs to start acknowledging that fact that we have this kind of artificial limitation put on us, and if they're not going to do it voluntarily, let's try to force it in a court of law as part of the longer trial that's getting ready to happen probably next year. So if we could calendar that for a discussion with Baker Donaldson, that'd be great.
Mrs. Pierce.
Let me go back to the Merle School for a second. So I can understand the discussion that we just had and that we've had in Capitol about using an asset like a building to then sell and use the proceeds to have another asset that's appreciating. Have you ever seen Metro use an asset like a building to use for operating expenses?
I don't remember that being done for the school district. I'm not sure about the rest of Metro government, but I don't remember that ever being done for the school system. There have been sales in the past where the proceeds would go to our capital fund, but not to our operating budget.
Right. It just seems I can't get on board with that.
I was going to ask a similar question, just as in how we could use, I didn't know we could use capital funds for operating funds. I thought they were kind of in two different buckets altogether. Say again?
We could solve a whole lot of problems that way.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around the numbers and make sure I understand. So it was appraised for $7 million, but the assumption has been made that it will sell for $13 million. If by some chance we did not vote for this to be a surplus, and don't get me wrong, I don't have any reason not to, but if we were not to vote this for Merle to be a surplus building and we didn't sell it, I'm assuming that would mean that we would not get $5 million and that we would be in the whole 8. Is that reasonable to assume, or?
That would be reasonable to assume. That would mean that we would have a $13 million funding shortfall in our funding sources. And this, they've categorized this in the budget ordinance as gain on sale of property, and they've got it coming into our operating budget. So yes, we would just have $13 million fewer dollars coming into our operating budget, and our budget would be out of balance by that amount.
Nice.
Amy.
What's happened to the $7.5 million deficit that we have from this year? How have we made that up?
That would come out of fund balance for this year, and that they've already taken that into consideration. That $7.5 million we will not receive that BEP growth funding for this year, and so that was all calculated in determining how much additional funding we would need for next year, BEP, fund balance, et cetera. That was all calculated. Current year, $7.5 million. Next year is also a reduction.
Did any of the spending freeze for the end of the year, did that offset the $7.5 million?
We're hoping that didn't go into effect until basically mid-March, and so we haven't had a lot of time for that to take effect. We'll be closing out the April books sometime within the next week or two, and we'll be able to see then if it's had much of an effect. It just isn't going to have a lot of time to make a lot of effect since it didn't go into effect until later.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a totally random observation that has nothing to do with the budget. We, as anxious as we all are about the budget, I just want to acknowledge that we're, for the first time, getting our first viewing of Baby Bugs, and Baby Bugs looks great.
Thank you.
Good job, Mom.
Seen him a lot. You just haven't been here.
You get a vote?
Yes. I think the Metro Charter will allow a 10th member under that circumstance.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
So I'll just conclude based upon that scenario that I just talked about. Our plan has been and will be to actually reduce the budget, the current year budget, the 17-18 budget, by approximately $17 million to take into consideration the additional $5 million that we would receive, plus the obligations of the school district that total up to a net of around $22 million for next year.
I am probably going to get in so much trouble for asking this question, but I have to. So that $10 million additional money that we were going to use for the school in Bellevue for capital funds, could that actually be rolled back into our operating budget so that we can like divvy that out amongst all of our schools?
Only, I guess, if the board were to approve it, and only if the Metro Council were to approve it that way as well. But I haven't asked that question, so I don't know.
Because I always thought that money had to stay in different buckets. But if it's like, because we've been given $5 million for the entire district, and that's $10 million for one school, and I would just love to be able to use $10 million just to kind of like offset some of these costs that we have. Just a thought. We haven't actually voted yet. Mary?
Well, I do. If you will walk through, Chris, just a little bit on the numbers that are used for the charter students to arrive at the 13.9. It's on the charter page. It has a per pupil allocation of 9,800. So walk me through how you arrive at 13.9 with that, please.
Don't have a calculator with me, but I'll walk you through what we use. It would be typically the 1,188 additional students multiplied by a per pupil amount, which in this case we're estimating right now $9,800 per student. And then for the remainder of the, I was using that as an excuse.
I'm typing it in.
Thanks for all your help.
That's what you did, all right hand man. I need one of those. I need one of those.
Team members. So we would take the additional 1,188 charter students multiplied by the $9,800 per student amount that we're estimating. And then we would take the remainder of all of the charter students, which would be the difference between the 12,766 students and the additional 1,188, and bump that per pupil amount up for those students as well from the current year $9,600 figure per pupil to next year's $9,800 per pupil. Now, I don't know if that's going to add up exactly right, but that's the concept that would be used, where we would be adding additional students at the per pupil rate and then increasing the per pupil rate for all of the remaining charter students, because that would be the same per pupil rate as students in MNPS run schools.
Okay, because that's where I'm glad do you have a calculator now? Because when I look at the total state and local, and I'm going by what David Briley is allocating, or why don't we, better yet, we could do this year's. So if you have 879, 299, 700, and you do the total pupils, Are you going to?
There's more to that calculation than just taking that number, because there are some of those accounts within that the state doesn't count. And they're the ones that provide us with that formula and with that per pupil amount, but I just don't have it in front of me. I didn't.
Okay. Well, it's helpful to walk through all those extra little lines because, you know, when we do have a transparent budget year, you do have a lot of people at home doing their calculations, and then that's why there's been a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I would have been happy to bring that calculation with me if I knew that were.
Well, I mean, I didn't know all this was coming either. So, so anyway, when you have a per pupil average for the district students, are you saying that they're exactly 9,800 as well?
9,800 was an estimate that was put together probably back in February when we were putting the first budget draft together. So we have not updated that yet.
Okay.
That concludes questions.
Okay, so I'll move into just recommended priorities to guide the budget, and then I'll pass it back over to Mr. Henson, and he'll talk about possible areas of reduction that we have been looking at as an administration. But in terms of the priorities guiding the budget process that we're looking at, I mean, we think first and foremost it is essential that we preserve the school budgets that have already gone out to schools. Schools have been planning, they've been hiring teachers, and as Ms. Hunter shared in her introduction, you know, we're very proud of the fact that we really have focused on equity, getting dollars to where they're needed in a more thoughtful manner this year, and also giving the $5 additional million in special education funds and the $2 million additional dollars for English language learners. We think that's important because these are areas that have been woefully underfunded historically, and we want to make attempts to do right by them. But those dollars are already in our schools, and we have to lock them in and make sure that teachers and principals know that the budgets they have are the budgets that they will keep, and there won't be mass hysteria about layoffs and things of that nature at the schoolhouse. So that's one budget priority that I think should guide us as we're looking at this work. Also, I think it's essential that we collaborate because when you have to make tough decisions, you've got to have people closest to the work with you looking at how we make these decisions. So we have a commitment to work closely with our Teachers Association and SEIU 500 and work together to look at how we can, knowing that this is a very difficult budget to add dollars for salaries. We want to make sure we do everything to look at what we can do to improve our climate and our commitment to climate. So in both SEIU and MNEA, we did pass memorandum of understandings that will hopefully help us establish clearer cultures and a commitment to respect as we work in our schools. So looking to make sure those things that don't cost anything are a priority, will be a priority for us. But we want to make sure that we preserve that and also preserve the steps and actions that have resulted in us growing faster than the nation in reading and mathematics. I mean, we have done some great things as you look at the sheet that I gave you and those 7 priority areas, pushing on them. Although we may be required to pause in some of those areas, we're going to be looking critically, particularly with literacy being our focus. How do we continue accelerating in literacy at the rate we've accelerated this year? And simultaneously, how do we do that in math? Those are the areas that I think should guide us in our initial steps. And I will kick it back to Mr. Henson to talk about the possible areas of reduction that we as a team have already begun exploring.
Well, thank you, Dr. Joseph. One thing that we, as Dr. Joseph indicated, that we decided, Dr. Joseph decided, was that we would not touch individual school budgets through this process. We're already adding $7.2 million to the student-based budgeting formula. Schools have their budgets. Schools have their budgets approved, and they've already begun hiring for next year. And so the decision was made that we would not go back and reduce anything in the student-based budgeting formula, and we would not touch individual school budgets. So what we've begun looking at would be our contracted services, looking at contracts that are in the operating budget. We have a lot of contracts that are either federally funded or funded by grants, but obviously we're concentrating solely on, solely on our operating budget. So looking at contracts, contracted services, where we can either reduce contracts or where we can eliminate contracts, realizing that we have to reduce $17 million from the current year, 17-18 budget. And so it wouldn't be reduction from what was proposed for next year. It would actually be a reduction from what we have in place for this year. We also are looking at anywhere we might have vacancies that are not at the school level, not at the school site, and potentially not filling those vacancies. Those would typically be central office or centralized departments where they have vacancies. We also have been discussing new initiatives that were just instituted this year, this current school year, and putting some of those on hold. Where we would not continue those next year. There would be a delay as we made it through this challenging fiscal year for next year. So some of our new initiatives that we just began this year, some of those may be delayed or put on hold for next year. Then we also looked at the other non-personnel line items in addition to contracted services, things such as supplies and materials or other expenses, looking at those very hard, potentially looking at looking at a percentage across the board reduction in some of those line items to see where we might be able to pull together some more money, some more funds. So those are the main areas where we have been attempting. We're trying not to have a wholesale reduction in force or mass layoffs or anything of that nature. We're trying to look at where we might make reductions that would not affect employees, particularly as it relates to filled positions, where we can look at and realizing that it's a challenging year and that $17 million is a large sum for us to come up with, but we've begun that process.
And just to add on our vacancies and looking at them, I mean, there are some key critical positions that will need to be filled, but we are really scrutinizing what those central vacancies are and which should and shouldn't be eliminated. And one of the things I have communicated to all chiefs is that we will not we will not solve this deficit on the backs of our employees who don't make lots of dollars. So we're not looking to eliminate, our secretarial staff and other things of that nature as we look towards central office. It really would need to be at the coordinator level on up as we worked through this. That is important to us in terms of a value system. And so I told them, don't send me that because it will be rejected.
Thank you. Can I ask a question? So before it gets misconstrued, when you say supplies and materials, I know that at the school level, principals determine, paper, ink, what they're going to buy, how much they're going to buy. That doesn't come from central office.
Correct.
So we wouldn't be saying that we're reducing the amount of paper or the amount in a budget that we're giving a school to allocate to paper.
Correct, and I'm glad you made that clarification. We would not be proposing to reduce or change any school budget, and the school budgets would be where they have their paper and their supplies and materials. We are not proposing to make any changes to school budgets. This would be district-wide departments, district-wide accounts, that kind of thing.
Do you mind if we tweet that to make sure that nobody misconstrues from this conversation that we're taking paper from the kids?
Yes, thank you.
I appreciate it.
I'm glad you clarified it.
The new initiatives that will be delayed, can you name some of those new initiatives this year that will be delayed next year?
I'll defer to Dr. Joseph because we've had some preliminary discussions, but we haven't made any hard decisions yet at this point since we've only known about this for a week now. So I'll defer to Dr. Joseph.
And I would say I would defer until next week until we finalize them. I wouldn't want to make any early conversation on that until we explore all options and see what the numbers are and put them back in. But new initiatives are new initiatives, the ones that were in our budget last year and in previous years would be the first that we would look at because they just came in. They were a part of the work that accelerated, but our key is to, again, focus on those new initiatives that directly affected reading and mathematics we'd want to preserve because that's where we have been moving and that has been a stated priority. But other initiatives that may not be in those areas would be subject to us looking at. But we need to take a holistic look to see how many dollars we can recapture before we can prioritize.
Will.
So is next week too soon to come back to the table for this conversation? Because it seems like there's a lot of details that are going to have to be decided in a matter of 7 days. So, for example, with these new initiatives that might be cut, I think we need to see, in addition to kind of the name of the initiative and the line item associated with it, which schools it affects, because I think parents in the school communities need to understand that, stuff that we're going to benefit from, that might not necessarily benefit from. Now, and then the question is, are you all proposing potentially to fund charter growth at a time that we're not growing other stuff?
It's here in the budget proposal that was approved by the board, and so my understanding is that would be an obligation of the district, but.
And I can add to that, and I'll ask Ms. Harkey to come to the microphone as well. Our legal, we did. The question was brought to our attention about our obligation for the continuation of funding our charters, and it's my understanding that since the district has made the obligation to charters and we've contractually had an agreement with them that it would be appropriate for us to continue that obligation. But Ms. Harkey can elaborate on that thinking.
And certainly if there are specific questions or if at some point it makes sense for us to move to an executive session, discuss some of this in more detail, certainly we can do that. But I think there is a Tennessee Code provision, 4913-112, that does require it says a local board of education shall allocate to charter school an amount equal to the per student, state, and local funds received by the LEA and all appropriate allocations under federal law and regulation. So there is a provision that says that we shall allocate those funds to charter schools. Specific to charter growth, there is nothing in state law that references specifically charter growth and whether that is required. We, however, certainly I think our charter agreements do reference the applications, and there are provisions in terms of what capacity is provided to a charter school at each year.
Yeah, I'd like to take you up on the offer for an executive session to explore our legal options. I mean, I think that, it's not moral to consider to continue feeding one sector at the expense of employee pay raises and other new services that we were intending to provide to students in traditional schools that we're now not going to be able to do because we've got to fund continue funding this stuff, growth. It's not like we would be taking away anything from anybody. It'd just be saying everybody's got to tighten their belts, and this is a status quo year, and we're doing it on our side of the school system. I'm not sure why we can't ask the charter quote-unquote partners to do it as well. But yeah, let's have an executive session to explore our legal options, please.
Right. Well, I just want to make some clarifications on that as well. First of all, just even defining growth. I mean, what are you calling growth, Mr. Pinkston? We've contracted with our charters, and this was all mapped out. So it was, but regardless, if you go back to those 1188 students, and you just say, for instance, we tell them you're not going to have a seat any longer. How much money do we gain? Because we still have to educate them here in the district. And we've seen, especially with those per pupil added weights that are going out to the schools, we already know in real time that we often fund on a pure per pupil basis much higher the zone schools from which those charter students typically come. So for all we know, we could actually be needing to request even more money from Metro Council if those 1188 students stayed in the district.
Yeah, not knowing where they might go to school, I do know the average per pupil amount in the student-based budgeting formula is around $6,500. That's the average that goes out to all of our schools. Some schools, of course, are going to be higher funded than that because it's an average, and some are going to be lower funded than that. So it really depends upon where they might go back to school. But yes, there would continue to be a cost to the district to educate those same students in district-run schools. Yes.
Right, and then we also have a lot of money in centralized services that's not just buses and utilities. It's the EL support, it's literacy support. So to think that you could just absorb those students back in and not have to increase those amounts is not realistic. So, I mean, I think that it would be great if Mr. Pinkston is serious about, trying to break our contract legally, then it would be great if you could model that out and actually put a number on it to say this is what we would actually realize back in the district, to even know if you could do much with that.
The key on that calculation would be knowing where they might go to school.
I would think our student assignment has that.
Of the 1188 that haven't enrolled yet?
Well, they would have accepted a seat, wouldn't they?
I assume so.
I mean, I think you could look at those new grades. I mean, I would think you could get a range.
We could work on that if we need to.
Anyone else? Amy.
I just want to take a minute to talk about literacy, because we keep talking about that being a priority for the district. And this board, at our last budget vote, we've essentially voted to get rid of nearly 100 of our best reading teachers, and here's why. We were promised that there would be a plan for these teachers. We would promise that there would be positions available for these teachers. There is no plan. And the school budgets don't allow for the schools to hire these teachers. And we were promised that they could go to priority schools, and they can't because there aren't positions available. So the reality is that they've been taken out of our priority schools. There are no positions available. There's no money to rehire them in our elementary schools. And so as a result of that vote, we are really losing our very best literacy teachers. They are leaving the district. They're retiring. They're going to other districts. They're going to other states. And whether or not you like Reading Recovery as a program, the fact that we got rid of these teachers, that we're essentially firing them without any plan in place to improve our literacy in the district, it's not the way. That's not the way to improve literacy. So, I think we need to be far more intentional and thoughtful about what we are doing with literacy. If we can keep saying that's our priority, but unless our actions reflect that that's our priority, we're not going to improve our literacy scores. And just on the charter debate, I will say, we right now are where MGT warned that we would be several years ago. I mean, we are finally to the point, the tipping point, that we are seeing that the charter schools they're absorbing all of our new available revenue. So somebody has to make the cut, and it will be us. It will be the traditional schools. It will not be our charter sector that makes the cut. So here we are. So that's all I have to say.
I just have one more question. So based on what Ms. Farag just said, will a district student not receive $9,800 from state and local money?
Yes, because it's based upon the full calculation of the operating budget.
Okay.
The amount that goes out to schools is not that amount because, as mentioned earlier, there are some centralized services provided on behalf of schools. But the calculation of the per pupil amount when we talk about state and local revenue would be the same, whether it's in MNPS run schools or charter schools.
Exactly.
And
Just to answer a few pieces on the literacy piece, because it's important. Again, we didn't have 100 teachers. We have 83.5 teachers that were
7.
not 100 teachers, thank you, that were not going in. Principals do have the autonomy to use their budgets to hire teachers. Now, we do acknowledge the fact that some budgets are tight and some principals were able to retain their folks and some were not. We can get the board specific information if you'd like the information on how many were there. We do have enough vacancies to make sure that those teachers that were released are able to be hired. We did guarantee those teachers positions and we're committed to doing that. And we did say that we would give a $2,500 stipend for teachers that were in kindergarten, first or second grade and went to one of the 21 priority schools. Again, we can give the board an update on where we are with that. I think it's important when we communicate that we don't communicate in hyperbole, that we are real specific and explicit because we're dealing with people's lives, and I'm very sensitive about making sure that we're accurate in our communications because we don't want to create a sense of unnecessary hysteria. But I'd happily make sure that we can provide you with the specific information upon request. We do have human resources individuals that are working with these teachers to make sure that they're placed. And we said that if there were any issues, we would work with those teachers to resolve them. But again, I like to speak with specifics, and I'd happily give the board specific updates on where we are with the teachers that have been hired, how many teachers have not been hired yet, and what the status is, if that is a request of anyone from the board.
I'd like to respond to that. I've checked out this information today, and 20 out of the 87 teachers, 23 have jobs. Out of those, 3 will go into kindergarten, 3 will go into first grade, 3 will go into second grade, 2 will go into an elementary school, but the grade is not determined. 3 will go into middle school. 2 will go into EL, 1 part-time, 1 will go into special education, 1 will go into high school, 1 will be in LTDS that was asked by her principal to move in that position before all of this happened. 1 will retire and 1's going out of state. 0 are going to priority schools.
So if I just may add one more time, one thing that we wanted to do with our employees is give them options. We did not want to tell anyone where they must go. We gave them the option to go where they chose to go. We are working with human resources, and if any of those individuals have any questions, we've been working with human resources to do so. But our goal, again, in terms of strategy, is to simply get our teachers the option to continue to work in our neediest schools if they choose to do so. If they do not choose to do so, they have the right to do that. I mean, one of the things we want to do is make sure people go where they feel they can be best served. And I had the pleasure of speaking with all of those teachers for hours and their principals, and we talked through those scenarios, and we're working closely with them because we do value them. But people have choices, and we believe in choice. We respect choice, and we think it is a good thing.
Let's be clear and honest.
Wait.
Let me respond to him, please.
Mary needed to speak. Mary.
Would you mind if I respond to that statement?
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate it. These teachers would love to be in priority schools. That's where they have been. There are no openings. So it's not a matter, let's be clear and honest, it's not a matter that they don't want to be in priority schools, Dr. Joseph. The simple fact is that there are no openings in priority schools. They would love to be there.
Okay,
thank you, Mary.
I would like to just ask if just one board member wants to go into executive session to talk about how we can possibly break the law, can we vote on that, whether we would like to do that, or is it something that we could discuss transparently in future budget meetings?
I do have a naming committee meeting at 4 o'clock.
Okay.
Well, that's just something I would like for us to, before we just schedule an executive session, I think the whole board would need to speak to the transparency of that.
Do you mind?
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Christian.
I've had a lot of thoughts during this budget season, and I'm going to choose to say less and not say more. I do want us to remember that we are always focused on children. Anytime we come to sit around this board table, anytime we're in this building, our main focus is students. Like, they are little people, young people, children, babies. Whatever we're thinking, whatever frustrations we have, I think we can talk through them amicably. The tension has gotten it's gotten tense, and I just don't want us to slip back into being that dysfunctional board that I heard about before I ran for a board seat. I'll just leave it there. Can we just please remember we're talking about students, and that's our focus whenever we have a conversation.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to adjourn this meeting.
Tice, would you announce what time this meeting is?
Scheduled tentatively a May 15th and May 22nd for budget meetings. We're going to take a vote on the 22nd meeting so that we can appear at the council meeting on the 23rd.
Will there be any public participation?
We have not planned any public participation up until this time.
What time? 3 or 4?
We haven't set the times yet.
Oh, okay.
We going into
Committee meeting.
session?
No, committee meeting. It's naming.